There are a lot of games out there nowadays which allow players to make moral decisions. Games like Fable, Fallout, Mass Effect, and Baldur's Gate. You can be the hero, or you can be the anti-hero, and sometimes even the villain. And if you were to see me play any of these games, you would call me a Boy Scout. Because I am never the evil one. For whatever reason, evil playthroughs are always the second time around, let's see what changes type of playthrough. First time around, I always want to be the good guy, the knight in shining armor, the hero of the story. Except that is for one set of games. Ah yes, Knights of the Old Republic, the classic Star Wars RPG where you can choose to be either a Jedi or a Sith. And from the very first time I played through one of these games when I was a young lad up to the present, I have never hesitated to be the most brutal, badass Sith Lord imaginable. And why is that? Because the Sith freaking rule. Red lightsabers, lightning blasting, force choking, and the coolest appearances of any characters I've ever seen. Seriously, look at this. And this. And this. And even the single most recognizable villain in all of fiction is a mechanized pseudo-cyborg Sith Lord. The Sith have always been the coolest villains in fiction, and none of the ones I've shown you so far are even my personal favorite. Not even Vader. That honor goes to none other than that man's apprentice in his darkest form. Because Lord Starkiller is my favorite Sith Lord. Due to his horror-inspired appearance and incredibly tragic tale of vengeance gone awry. I mean, look at this. He looks like a cross between Vader, Freddy Krueger, and a xenomorph into some horrifying conglomeration of the ultimate Sith nightmare. Which is why, when the DLC for The Force Unleashed began coming out, I was blown away that the direction of these expansion passes was towards the game's alternate dark side ending. And they, without a doubt, became my favorite part of the Force Unleashed game. So in this video, we will be exploring these missions, giving a thorough retrospective look and analysis at them, and discussing what they bring to the table both as missions to this game and as a Star Wars story. But before we get to the good stuff, we will also have a look at the game's Jedi Temple DLC mission that never made it into the final game, to ensure we cover all our bases. So join me as we explore the ultimate Sith power fantasy that is Star Wars, The Force Unleashed's DLC missions. The first mission we will be taking a look at is the Jedi Temple DLC. The level begins with a fade-in of the Coruscant landscape as the Rogue Shadow approaches the Jedi Temple. During the approach, we get some kind of briefing from Proxy. However, the volume of the ship and the landscape is significantly louder than Proxy's. So I actually couldn't make out what he was saying in any capacity. I'm not sure if this is a sound equalizing issue or some kind of bug, but either way it stands out because I have never encountered an audio problem like this at any point during the original campaign. The audio then balances out to its regular equalization as Starkiller begins to speak, stating this is the only place he is aware of where he can learn about his father. Fairly vague goal, but a goal nonetheless. We get a pretty sweet ship-to-ground sequence, and on the way down, I double-check the powers screen to confirm that our powers are, in fact, entirely maxed out. This makes sense considering this is a one-off DLC mission, but it's very noticeable throughout the level that Starkiller is incredibly overpowered for where he should be at this point in the story, that being directly after the Kashyyyk mission. Ultimately, however, there's nothing truly wrong with being overpowered in this game, so it's not a complaint in so much as it is an observation. After clearing the landing pad of Imperial forces, we must raise the lightsabers on these stone statues out of the way in order to enter the temple. This is a pretty bizarre method of locking a door and is clearly just there for aesthetics and sense of scale, but it's still very silly, so much so that it actually takes away from the aura of entering the temple to begin with, especially since we've never seen anything remotely like this in any other piece of mainstream Star Wars media that I'm aware of, and is logically a very stupid door mechanism. As we enter the temple, Coda states that the holocron we are looking for is on the other end of the hall, and we will have to clear a pathway in order to get there. I'm not sure how Coda knows what we are looking for, or if he knows what it will provide, adding to the sense that this is all somewhat rushed and incomplete, as there's no fleshing out whatsoever to the story of this level. Either way, it'd be nice to know what the heck is going on and why some characters seem aware of what Starkiller is looking for, when Starkiller himself seems vaguely unaware. In Starkiller's way to said holocron is a massive statue and other debris. As we enter the central chamber, we are surrounded by Jedi statues which stand tall amongst the rubble, and overall I must say that this environment is beautiful and very well designed. It is both nostalgic for its recognizable architecture, yet original with its own take on the iconic Jedi Temple. After clearing the central chamber of enemies, there are two possible doors to go through, a fairly clear indication that the method to clearing the statue and debris will be found on the other side of each door. Upon using the Force to enter the doorway, we enter an area of familiar-looking hallways, since they are clearly stripped from the prequel era of content, and this hallway leads into a room which Coda describes as a Padawan training chamber, and how the hell does he know that before we describe it to him? No, I'm not going to rip the character details apart. There was enough of that in the last video. We're moving on. Coda warns us that there are training droids that could be active before the room suddenly locks us in. Proxy-style training droids then begin spawning in the room through various statues. These training droids use lightsabers, can teleport, and use force powers. Their quantity is plentiful and would likely be quite formidable if we didn't have nearly every ability and stat fully upgraded, but they are a fun and challenging mob nonetheless. The fight with them drew on for quite some time before I began to question how long the horde of enemies would take to defeat, which is when I took it upon myself to try destroying their spawning statues. It turns out they're destructible, and in order to finish the fight you have to destroy each of the spawning statues, followed by the remaining horde of droids. There's no indication of this objective, which is why I ended up fighting these droids for an obnoxiously long time. I don't love this exclusion of clear objectives, but I suppose the counter to that is that the game is attempting to employ problem solving, so it requires the player's discernment, and I will admit I am less than observant than the average gamer, therefore maybe this is obvious to other individuals. Upon destroying all of the statues and the droids, a door on the room's upper floor opens, and following the hallway it enters us into leads to a platform where, following an encounter with a group of Imperial jump troopers, we are able to raise a bridge that we will use to cross the chasm in the center of the temple, although the large statue remains in our way. Raising the bridge also opens up the path back to the central chamber. We then take the next entryway in the chamber to a room filled with dozens of Imperial troopers. This room is aesthetically awesome, containing astronomy displays and stained glass windows, and the quantity of enemies makes for a very fun combat sequence, which turned this section into one of the highlights of the overall level. Upon reaching the end of the room, we find ourselves in another hallway, and traversing through it leads to another platform where we are able to use the force push power in order to destroy the statue in the middle of the chamber, which was blocking our way, which means we are now fully capable of jumping over the chasm into the room which will contain the holocron we are seeking. Leaping over the chasm in the central chamber and entering the doorway leads to a hallway that looks like it was pulled straight out of Hogwarts, and at the end of the hallway is the holocron. Getting close enough to the holocron begins a cutscene. Starkiller touches the platform the holocron is on, and a hologram of Starkiller's father appears. He states that Vader was right about Starkiller being in control of his own destiny, and that the dark side is strong in him, which Starkiller is obviously dejected by, but his father also states that he can be saved from it. The blood of the Jedi is flowing in him, and therefore he must face the Jedi trials, leading to Starkiller being teleported to the trials. First thing to note is that the audio problems are back in this cutscene. Here's a demonstration of just how quiet this cutscene gets.
My blood flows through you, but you must face the Jedi trials.
Proxy, I can already sense them, but this is the only place that I can find out more about my father.
I own this game on GOG rather than on Steam, since the Steam port has known audio issues, and these issues weren't present anywhere else in the game, so I'm assuming this has to do with the mission, and is perhaps a reason why this level never made its way into the final version of the game. It sucked to get this far in and have no idea what was being said between the main character and his father without going back and raising the audio levels externally, meaning that I didn't, at the time of playing, understand why I was doing what I was doing, which is never a good thing for a video game. The second thing to get into is that, story-wise, this game takes place right after the Kashyyyk mission and before the Felucia mission of the game. This means that Starkiller is still working for Vader, with the goal of overthrowing the Emperor, so why does he look so dejected about his father recognizing the dark side in him? It's bizarre characterization because he is literally a Sith in terms of his loyalty. The final thing to ask is, what even is this holocron? Why does it show Starkiller his father? Why can nobody else see or hear what's going on with this thing? Is it just random force magic? Holocrons traditionally store information. They don't produce visions and projections, and there's no way his father has any of this information before his death and has it stored at the temple for obvious reasons. Also, how did Coda know Starkiller would find answers to his father in the temple through this specific magic holocron? Fictional objects with omnipotent powers to solve internal character drama are they're actual complete dog and should never, ever, ever be a thing. And this is just scratching the surface. I could spend so long ragging on the story of this mission, but it really comes down to one thing. None of this makes any sense. It's honestly a really good thing this level was not part of the main story, because the original story of the game already has so many problems with its narrative cohesion, and this would have nuked any semblance of said cohesion. This is all very poorly written and spectacularly incoherent, and is honestly the lowest point that this game goes in terms of writing in any mission. Returning to the level, the player is tasked with completing the Trials of the Mind. We find ourselves standing on small platforms in a dark liminal space as a blue ball is attached to a blue line in front of us. It's pretty obvious that the goal is to use the Force to move the ball to the other end of the line. Moving it too far off the line resets its placement, starting the challenge over again. There's 3 different patterns that need to be completed, and doing so succeeds the first trial. It's simple. Almost childishly so, and there's no doubt a more interesting and thought-provoking puzzle wouldn't have been too hard to come up with. I'm not a game developer and the mechanics of the game are fairly limited, so I can only complain so much, but this was nothing short of offensively easy. The next trial consists of moving transparent platforms into positions that turn them solid and creates a path for us to walk across. Again, ridiculously simple, although not quite as creatively brain-dead as the other challenge, so I accept it as preferable to the previous one. Upon completion of the challenge, Starkiller lands on a circular platform amidst the darkness, and a cutscene plays. He hears heavy, distorted breathing and looks behind him to see a cloud of dark mist, and emerging from it is what we now know is Lord Starkiller. Although, theoretically, we wouldn't know this at this point in the story. A boss battle between Starkiller and his dark counterpart then begins. Like other Jedi boss fights in the game, his resistance to Force powers is fairly random, and unlike other bosses, he employs Force Lightning, which can be a you-know-what to block. He also has an ability that covers the environment in Force energy, causing the player's controls to get reversed, which is annoying, but a cool power and quite unique. I appreciate its inclusion, but damn, I hate it when games reverse my controls and make me feel like an idiot as I try to gather myself. Something also of note is that the boss cycles between the Jedi robes light side version of Starkiller and the Lord Starkiller costumes throughout the fight. This is odd based on the story being told. It does reflect the 2 paths Starkiller can go down, but it messes with the subtext of Starkiller overcoming his personal darkness, so I'm not a fan of this choice. Getting Lord Starkiller to around a third of his health triggers a QuickTime event where the real Starkiller knocks off the Sith Lord's mask, revealing that it is indeed Starkiller underneath, very reminiscent of Luke's experience with the cave on Dagobah. This changes the boss's name to Dark Apprentice, as he destroys our current platform, leading to the second phase of the fight. At the beginning of, and throughout this phase, the Dark Apprentice begins destroying the platform with the Force and hurling the debris at Starkiller, forcing us to dodge said debris. I love how this causes the environment to also become more challenging to traverse as the fight goes on, even though I did a very poor job of dodging the debris that was thrown at me. This second phase was significantly more challenging than the first, and according to my health bar, I was essentially defeated before pulling together a spectacular rally to put the boss fight in the bag before losing whatever sliver of health I had left. For the QuickTime finisher, Starkiller leaps at the Dark Apprentice, slashing him multiple times until he falls off the platform. However, the Dark Apprentice grabs Starkiller's ankle, pulling him into the abyss. Starkiller grabs hold of some floating debris, dodges a lunging Dark Apprentice, and is able to get behind him. However, the Dark Apprentice disappears as soon as he's hit, and reappears above Starkiller, where he begins throwing debris at Starkiller with the Force. Starkiller uses the debris to run back up onto the platform with the Dark Apprentice, get behind him, and finally pierce him with his lightsaber, defeating him for good. This is a really sweet finisher, especially the sequence with Starkiller running up the debris to reach the Dark Apprentice. That's some Naruto shit, and I'm a big fan. The overall boss fight sequence with the Dark Apprentice is the highlight of the level as a whole, with unique sequences, new powers to overcome, and a rapidly changing environment. The scene following the fight transitions to Starkiller waking up as he lies on the ground in front of the holocron, confirming that this was something akin to a vision quest rather than reality. He looks down at his hand to see it is reminiscent of the deformed hand of the Dark Apprentice, as a harsh voice exclaims, "You can't escape." Coda asks if Starkiller is still there, breaking the dark illusion, with Starkiller confirming his mission has been accomplished as the level ends. So, I'll be straightforward, this level is mostly crap. Segments are nonsensical when held up to logical scrutiny, the story is even worse in that regard and moves nothing forward, and the puzzle designs are short and brain dead. However, it does pack a good kick of nostalgia to it as someone who grew up during the prequel era, and the final boss fight is quite good, so it has something going for it, but between the bugs and the general poor quality of the level, I'm glad this is a DLC mission and not part of the main campaign, and I'm also quite glad I will never have to play it again, and that we can move on to the good stuff, beginning with the Tatooine DLC mission. This mission begins with an opening crawl and is clearly intended to be an alternate version of A New Hope, with its alternate name, A Fragile Hope. The first paragraph is actually the same paragraph as the first paragraph from A New Hope's opening crawl, discussing the Rebel Alliance's first victory over the Galactic Empire. The second paragraph is also the same as it is in A New Hope, describing how the victory included stealing plans for the Death Star. The third paragraph is where the opening crawl deviates from A New Hope. The original film's third paragraph describes how Leia is returning to Alderaan aboard a ship with the Death Star plans. However, the DLC mission we are embarking on explains that the Emperor is dispatching Starkiller directly to Tatooine to retrieve the plans. Both paragraphs end with the sentence, "Restore freedom to the galaxy," which is a nice touch to tie it all together. The camera pans down to show a Star Destroyer above Tatooine discarding the Tantive 4 before the scene cuts to depict a distant shot of Jabba's palace, before being shown Jawas failing to repair a Gonk droid. As they repair the droid, a heavily bandaged and disfigured individual with a multi-pronged lightsaber approaches. The lightsaber is activated, and the Jawas are mercilessly struck down. This figure is revealed to be Lord Starkiller, appropriately dressed for the sands of Tatooine, as he communicates via hologram with the Emperor. The Emperor remarks that Starkiller has yet to track down the droids with the Death Star plans, while referring to Starkiller as his apprentice. Starkiller confirms his failure, and the Emperor directs him to seek Jabba the Hutt for reliable information about the droids, leading to the official start of the mission. The intro sequence to this mission is full of aura, for lack of a better term. The alternate episode 4 setting is a true stroke of genius, as it comes with a dose of nostalgia alongside a built-in plethora of questions that harnesses the power of intrigue, which is centered on Starkiller's interactions with various characters from the original trilogy, as well as how his role causes deviations in the plot. I'd also like to point out how awesome Starkiller's Tusken Raider-inspired outfit is. It works exceptionally well, adding an element of subterfuge to the mission, which is enhanced by the crawl's descriptions of him as an assassin, rather than as an apprentice. I must admit, I'm curious as to the motivations of Starkiller in this alternate universe, motivations that don't get explained in this opening sequence. In the original timeline, Darth Vader was motivated by loyalty to the Emperor and the Empire, as well as the prospect of one day overthrowing him. Vader was a true Sith. But is Starkiller the same? He didn't actually betray the Rebel Alliance in the dark side ending, but his selfishness and hatred did screw everything up. Here, he refers to the Emperor as his master, but he would likely harbor more hatred to the Emperor than Vader did, due to the nature of their relationship. I understand why we don't have answers to these questions. There's only so much to pack into a DLC mission for a video game, but it would have been still nice to get some of those answers. As we begin traversing the cliffsides of Tatooine, a man by the name of Captain Barris phones in to inform us he has been dispatched to assist as needed. Not too far ahead, a Jawa sandcrawler can be seen blocking our path, and upon defeating the nearby Jawas, we are able to force push it off the ledge in order to proceed in what is a really crazy demonstration of Lord Starkiller's power level. Another thing of note here that I observed fighting the Jawas, and is continuously present throughout the DLC missions, is that Lord Starkiller's lightning is noticeably more purple, similar to that of the Emperors from Return of the Jedi, likely representative of just how far Starkiller has fallen to the dark side. Further up the path to Jabba's palace, we encounter Tusken Raider snipers, a predictable but wise inclusion due to their relationship with the identity of Tatooine. After clearing out our aesthetic duplicates, we make our way to the gate of Jabba's palace, and upon approaching the door, the gatekeeper droid which appears in Return of the Jedi pops out to observe us. By using Force Lightning on the various eyes which pop out, we can overload the gate, causing it to open. This simple puzzle is a creative way to play into the lore, provide a callback, and implement the game's systems into a cohesive and logical part of the story, since it's unlikely a Sith assassin would be allowed to simply walk into Jabba's palace. The interior of Jabba's palace is recognizable from other Star Wars media, and as we enter in, the Hutt locks us inside, ordering his guards to attack and kill us since he believes Starkiller is a thief. The enemies we encounter are Gamorrean guards, and they are individually quite formidable due to their high health quantity, and therefore even more so formidable as a collective. Still, they fall like all the rest, and upon defeating a significant quantity of them, Jabba proceeds to open the gate and invite us in, hoping to discuss business. A cutscene begins upon entering the interior of the palace, and a scene reminiscent of Luke Skywalker arriving to Jabba's palace from Return of the Jedi plays out. As Starkiller approaches Jabba, he electrocutes a babbling protocol droid, displaying his impatience with the situation at hand. Jabba expresses his admiration for Starkiller, offering to make him a very wealthy man, but Starkiller's only interest is in the droids, as he describes R2-D2 and C-3PO as the droids he is looking for. Jabba explains there are too many droids on Tatooine to track them, but the protocol droid drops the ball by stating they are, in fact, aware of the location of both droids, and that they are both in Mos Eisley. Jabba, frustrated by this information slipping, drops Starkiller into the Rancor pit before Starkiller has an opportunity to react, beginning the next section of the level. This is a good cutscene overall. It plays well on nostalgia, with a familiar set design and a really well-designed Jabba, while making Starkiller's interactions with Jabba feel unique and individualized. However, the turn from cordial business to hostility is very sudden, as there's no real explanation as to why Jabba is keeping the droids a secret from us, as well as why Starkiller immediately resorts to violence when he seemed willing to do business a few moments ago. It's all quite rushed, too rushed, and I wish we could have gotten something more fleshed out here, since rushed moments like these make the mission feel like a light add-on when it has the potential to be more of a true expansion to the game. With the Jabba encounter behind us, it's to the Rancor pit we go. We are immediately greeted by none other than the iconic Rancor himself, which fights quite similarly to previous Rancors in the game, but with a little more health. Henceforth, the boss fight is quite easy, and to my absolute disappointment, the finisher is the same as other Rancor finishers. This finisher should absolutely use the large door to mimic how Luke killed the Rancor in Return of the Jedi, and I cannot understand why this is not the route they went, as it's a severely missed opportunity. You can tell they actually just copy and pasted the same animation from previous Rancors as well, because the lightning in the finishing sequence is blue, like the original campaign missions, instead of this mission's purple lightning. Maybe I'm being hyperbolic, but that's borderline neglectful for just how iconic this specific Rancor is. The next sequence of the level sees Starkiller escaping Jabba's palace by traversing a series of hallways while fighting off Weequay and Gamorrean guards. It's a long and uninteresting path with slight environmental variety, but feels mildly bloated and uncreative. Eventually, however, these hallways lead into a room where one droid is visibly torturing another, which is also a callback, as Captain Barris tells Starkiller he will dispatch a squadron to assist, but Starkiller forcefully rejects him and states he will bring the droids himself, demonstrating some level of pride or insecurity about his ability to complete this mission, which is an interesting bit of character development. The next room is an arena design with ranged enemies above and a hijacked Purge trooper, which is strange because during the original game I figured they were just larger clones, but it appears in this case that either the suit of armor itself was hijacked and filled with someone else, or is actually autonomous and programmable, and based on how it went from the inactive to active state as we approached it, the latter is more likely. I'm unfamiliar with the lore on these units, so feel free to leave a comment if you know what's going on here. Upon clearing the room, a large garbage chute door opens, and we enter into it to find ourselves in the junk room of Jabba's palace. As I was clearing out the Jawas in this room, I realized that there was a junked droid on the ground, and it was none other than Proxy. And not just a Proxy model of droid, but actually Proxy, as he recognizes Starkiller and then begins having a conversation with him. Starkiller asks Proxy to find a way out of the room, and Proxy informs Starkiller to lift him to the scanner to override it by turning into a guard, which works, and opens up the trash compactor for Starkiller to traverse through. With sorrow in his voice, Starkiller thanks Proxy, and Proxy exclaims how good it was to see his master again before shutting off for the last time. There's something really moving about this sequence and the way it's done. This relationship was so powerful in regards to the original story, it took up entire segments of the main campaign. But by this point, Starkiller has fallen so far that seeing Proxy again is little more than using him as a convenient object. No cutscene provided, and the regret in Starkiller's voice is apparent. He's hardly the man Proxy knew, even though Proxy still views him in that light until his final breath. It really highlights just how separated this man is from the man he once was and the journey he was on with people he once cared about. The next part of the level has Starkiller ducking and weaving through flames and large mechanisms in order to escape the trash compactor, a fairly common level design trope that I'm certainly not a fan of. Upon finding the exit, another cutscene ensues. Starkiller is approaching one of Jabba's sail barges in order to escape the palace, but is interrupted by none other than Boba Fett, who was clearly visible in the scene with Jabba. He states that a large bounty has been put on Starkiller's head, and he intends to collect on it. The boss fight with Boba Fett is offensively easy. He can't block force attacks, and hitting him with force lightning can cause his jetpack to malfunction, sending him to the ground and leaving him vulnerable to ground saber attacks that do insanely high damage. His health was down 3/4 of the way within a minute before some guards came out to assist him, and he put up a shield to finally prevent the onslaught of force and saber attacks. However, it didn't take much to break through the shield, hit him with some lightning, and finish the job. The entirety of the boss fight was less than 2 minutes, and I took almost no damage. In all honesty, a fight between Boba Fett and Lord Starkiller would realistically be about this simple for Starkiller, but considering how iconic Boba is, it's a real shame they couldn't come up with a more creative boss fight for him that utilized his power set in a way that could provide a challenge for the player and give some recognition to the bounty hunter's legacy. For the finisher, Boba throws a grenade, which Starkiller easily dodges before attempting to fire one of the missiles from his jetpack. However, Starkiller catches the missile mid-flight, turns it around, and throws it back at Boba, obliterating him entirely and leaving only a helmet in his stead. Much like the boss fight, Boba comes off as obviously outmatched, and it's a weak conclusion to the character in this timeline. Although, I have to admit, seeing Boba literally turn to dust via missile is oddly satisfying and pretty comedic. Ultimately, credit has to be given that Boba was able to be included as a boss fight at all, and in a coherent way, but that doesn't stop me from wishing they had done more with him, or at least done better. Starkiller then takes a speeder and rides past Slave 1 and towards Mos Eisley. The scene then immediately cuts to Mos Eisley hangar as C-3PO and R2-D2 board the Millennium Falcon, as Starkiller approaches the ship. However, as he begins to reach out to them with the Force, he is interrupted by none other than Ben Kenobi, and Starkiller states he has waited for many years for the opportunity to kill the real Obi-Wan, hearkening all the way back to the beginning of Starkiller's original journey. Ben's boss fight is reminiscent of previous Jedi boss fights from the original campaign, as Ben uses a variety of force powers while blocking many of Starkiller's, with saber fighting in between. One thing of note is that the camera for this fight is pretty bad, sitting very low to the ground and constantly moving at bizarre angles that mess with the game's controls. Despite this, the fight isn't too difficult and is pretty fun. The finisher sees Starkiller dueling Ben before headbutting him, picking him up with the Force, throwing him around, piercing him with his lightsaber, and then using the Force to throw Ben into the engines of the Millennium Falcon, which is insane. It's a thoroughly brutal finisher, one of the most hardcore in the game, if not the most hardcore, and I love it. If you're gonna have this absolute horror show of a Sith beat iconic characters, then let's do it, man. Go all out. I want to be able to throw heavy metal over top of these finishers and have it just work. This is how it's done. We're not done yet, however, because as soon as we obliterate Obi-Wan, the Falcon begins to take off and... Wait, what the hell? Okay, so let's get the elephant out of the room. This obviously makes absolutely no sense, unless you accept some of the garbage BS lore that came out of the sequel trilogy. However, in terms of both a subversion of expectations and a way to create a multi-sequenced boss fight, this is actually pretty creative. Since this is an alternate timeline, there's a lot more freedom to mess around with lore, and for an action video game boss fight, this works for me, and I'm a big fan of getting to fight Ghost Ben Kenobi. It's easily the most memorable part of this level. So, for all of my lore nerding that causes me to hold Star Wars narratives to very high standards, screw it. This rules. In terms of the actual boss fight, it's also quite creative, because we can't hit Ben with saber attacks since he's a Force Ghost. He also doesn't respond to physics-based Force attacks like Force Push. However, he is vulnerable to Force Lightning and saber attacks briefly after Force Lightning attacks. Also worth noting is that, in order to defeat me, there was a moment he started an environmental fire and Force pushed me into it. And I'm not sure if this was a convenient sequence of events or a really smart AI, but it was a hyper-intelligent move that caught me off guard. Despite that, I do eventually get the best of him with my barrage of lightning in what is another one of my regular close calls, ending what is an incredibly fun and memorable boss fight. For this finisher, Starkiller blocks Ben's saber before physically passing through him, allowing Starkiller to hit him from behind with lightning. Ben is able to block the lightning and push it back at Starkiller, but it's a fruitless effort, as Starkiller overpowers him with more lightning, eventually leading to the Force Ghost's obliteration and the final end of Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's not as brutal as the last finisher, but honestly, with a Force Ghost, I'm not sure how else you'd end this convincingly, so the simplicity of the finisher can certainly be forgiven considering the context. In the cutscene following this, Starkiller hears Ben call out to Luke to run, meaning that, well, he's not actually obliterated, which brings into question why he wouldn't just reappear to fight us again. Although the whole alternate timeline thing can forgive the whole fighting the Force Ghost thing, this just brings up even more questions, and I don't think this line should have been in there. They could have just let Kenobi stay disintegrated for good in order to prevent further convolution, since a narrative can only take so much of it. Starkiller leaps and gets a hold of the departing Millennium Falcon before losing his grip, landing aboard the hangar's walls, and watching the Falcon depart. However, Starkiller looks down, showing a device which appears to imply he planted a tracker aboard the Falcon as the mission ends, a solid conclusion that leaves a cliffhanger for more story to tell. This level is a massive step up from the Jedi Temple. There's a cohesive narrative that doesn't just include nostalgic content, but integrates the things we already know and love with this scenario to craft something new and original. The concept, the aesthetics, the nostalgia, and the execution are all top-notch. That doesn't mean this level is perfect, however. There are things that are rushed and things that are shoehorned in that don't work, whether that's to cram in nostalgia at the expense of crisp execution of concept, or rushing things through due to the likely corporate monetary and time limitations of crafting downloadable content for a significantly lower price than the main game. And that's the biggest knock on the level. It feels like DLC. But I want to revisit that point in a more formal way later in the video. For the time being, we have one more DLC mission to cover, the Hoth DLC. Once again, beginning with an opening crawl, this mission projects itself as an alternate version of The Empire Strikes Back, with its name, Wrath of the Empire. Maintaining the first two paragraphs from The Empire Strikes Back, the opening crawl describes the destruction of the Death Star and the Rebel Alliance's establishment of a base on Hoth. However, like the Tatooine mission, it deviates in the third paragraph. In the original crawl, Vader dispatches probes into space in an obsessive hunt for Luke. In the alternate one, Luke is struggling to master the Force with the assistance of Obi-Wan's spirit, as he prepares for a confrontation with Starkiller. I think it's interesting that in both DLC missions, Starkiller is referred to as a Sith assassin rather than an apprentice, demonstrating the Emperor's low regard for Starkiller, something evident in the last mission when referring to him as apprentice with significant disdain. The camera pans down to show the Imperial invasion of Hoth, as the scene then cuts to show the combat on the ground. The iconic first-person airspeeder shot is recreated, except this time, a lightsaber interrupts the speeder's flight, having come from none other than Lord Starkiller, as he dons an outfit which is far more reminiscent of Darth Vader than his previous Tusken Raider-inspired outfit. He leaps down from the AT-AT walker into the trenches of Hoth, and something I love about this outfit that we can see in the cutscene is an assortment of lightsabers around Starkiller's waist. Along his belt, we see lightsabers for Darth Maul, Darth Vader, and a few others I do not recognize, but I like the idea of Starkiller, as an assassin, collecting lightsabers as trophies. Also, I love the idea of him tracking down the real Darth Maul, defeating him and taking his lightsaber. More fanfiction daydreaming for yours truly. As the level begins, we find ourselves amongst the battlefield of Hoth with a large cave in front of us. A voice phones in, informing us their name is Captain Kina, our new liaison for this particular mission. As the chaos progresses around us, we enter into a Wampa cave, similar to the one Luke encountered in Episode 5. The Wampa is actually quite a difficult unit to kill due to its high health quantity, and this first one is not alone, as the cave and overall level is infested with them. Following the Space Yeti encounter, the next section of the cave is filled with platforms that disintegrate shortly after being touched, a common feature of platforming in video games. As we traverse, Captain Kina acknowledges he failed in accounting for the effect the walkers above would have on destabilizing the ice cavern, and in response to this failure, Starkiller force chokes him all the way from the cavern, ending his brief tenure as our guide and his life. This is a good demonstration of Starkiller's ruthlessness and his power level, as having the ability to manipulate the Force with such a great distance in between them is no small feat, and doing so to end the life of a captain for a simple miscalculation is quite petty and very brutal. After clearing the platform of a few more Wampas, we get another liaison in the form of Lieutenant Marson, and enter a section of the cavern with an entrance into the Echo base. Protecting the entrance is a collection of turrets which are simple enough to destroy, and removal of a nearby battery drops the force field, allowing our entry into the base. We are greeted by Rebellion forces, including a heavy unit that has a protective lightning shield, adding significantly to unit variety. As we move through Echo Base, Wampas begin breaking in, which maintains the combat variety throughout the level, and it's cool to see the Wampas combat rebel forces throughout the level. The next room forces us to overload the battery for a shield door by jamming it with a piece of debris. Once we do, the force field goes down, and a few rebels run out, and one of them trips and even yells,
"Whoa, you've got it, my lord."
Which is so funny. I can't tell if this is just a little bug or if it's intentional, and if it is intentional, I could see it being inspired by the stormtrooper running into the door in Episode 4, but either way, it made me legitimately bust out laughing due to its out-of-pocket nature. Following more traversal and combat, we find ourselves in a circular room with windows peering out into the snowscape of Hoth, and it's in this room I encountered something I don't believe occurred to me throughout the entirety of my time with this game. A crash. I'm not sure what triggered it, and it didn't happen again, but it was certainly unexpected considering the game's stability up to this point. Upon reloading the game, clearing the hallway, and moving on to the next section of the level, a cutscene plays as Starkiller enters a room and encounters none other than Luke Skywalker. Starkiller refers to him as the son of Vader, but Luke rejects this, stating his father was a Jedi who Starkiller murdered, thus clearly unaware of who Vader is at this point. A fight against Luke then commences. Luke doesn't do anything special gameplay-wise compared to other Jedi, and he honestly kind of sucks. This may be boring for gameplay, but it does make sense in terms of the character at this point in the story, and it does come back around later in the level. Something of note here is the way Luke speaks throughout the battle, which is in a manner that is quite hopeful, even claiming he senses the good in Starkiller. Also, another small thing I wanted to point out, there's a move Starkiller utilizes following a saber lock, where he throws Luke in the air and then slices him with his claws, which is just a really cool use of Starkiller's character design. There's no finisher for this fight, and instead a cutscene plays once Luke's health is almost drained. In the cutscene, Starkiller overpowers Luke, knocking him over and his lightsaber out of hand. Luke then rips a nearby door off the hinges with the Force, and Wampas charge out at Starkiller as Luke grabs his lightsaber and escapes. After defeating the Wampas, we proceed through the Echo base control rooms and hallways in order to reach the main hangar. This section of the game is infested with rebels, Wampas, and introduces snowtroopers into the fight, creating for a linear combat section which is incredibly chaotic and incredibly fun. There's also some unique environmental areas, such as this electrical ventilation shaft, which adds to the overall variety of the level. This all eventually leads into the main hangar, which is essentially the same level of chaos as the hallways preceding it in a much more open-ended environment. The objective for this section is to disable the force field protecting the Millennium Falcon and Princess Leia, likely to capture her and bring an end to the rebellion for good. It takes a significant amount of intense and chaotic combat, but eventually I get the force field down, but an emergency metal door closes, protecting the Millennium Falcon. Starkiller begins opening it with the Force, but is ambushed by our old friend Luke, who is visibly and auditorily much more angry than he was previously. The objective we are given is to enthrall Luke, demonstrating the hidden agenda of Starkiller, to make Luke his own apprentice, the same goal Vader had in the original trilogy. I think this is an awesome twist in the story, as it demonstrates that Starkiller is still an individual with his own plans and self-interest. Throughout this fight, Luke is much more aggressive, with more offensive force abilities and saber combos. Luke also recites more aggressive one-liners, describing how he intends to defeat Starkiller, which is a departure from his previous dialogue aimed at turning Starkiller back to the light. I also love how the conflict inside the hangar between Rebels and Empire forces is ongoing throughout the duel, as it makes the environment far more immersive. Overall, this sequence is a great continuation of the previous encounter with Luke. This time around, there's an actual finisher to the fight, as Starkiller essentially plays with his food before he tosses Luke around like a ragdoll with the Force. Starkiller taunts Luke with the death of his father, and Luke is obviously angered by this, leading into a third sequence of the boss fight where Luke's power and aura is consumed by red Force energy, nearly completing his turn to the dark side. Even in the Force clash, he begins using red lightning, and he becomes much faster, more difficult to hit, and far more aggressive. It's fascinating how in each sequence of confrontation with Luke, as he falls to the dark side, he becomes stronger and more aggro, giving a full demonstration of the power the dark side provides and how desperate Luke is to defeat Starkiller. Although Luke was indeed much more difficult to defeat once he is in his fallen form, he was still no match for Starkiller, leading to the final finisher. In this finisher, Starkiller physically overpowers Luke, and at one point throws him into the air to be hit by a land speeder, which is so badass. As Luke's rage begins to allow him to overpower Starkiller, Starkiller uses a nifty move to get a hold of Luke's lightsaber, allowing him to dismember Luke's arm, once again in reference to the original trilogy. As Starkiller goes in for a final blow, the Millennium Falcon begins to escape, but Starkiller grabs a hold of it with the Force. He then taunts Luke, telling Luke that only his hatred can allow him to save his friends. In a final bid for his friends' lives, Luke unleashes the full power of the dark side on Starkiller in a burst of red lightning, and the Falcon escapes. Starkiller incapacitates Luke, laughing and congratulating his new apprentice, as Luke gives one final enraged look with his yellow eyes, bringing the level to a close. There's so much to love about this ending sequence. The way Starkiller puts Luke in a practical situation to choose between his friends' lives and the dark side is brilliant, as it's one of the only imaginable scenarios where Luke would fully give in to the dark side. This is a strong bit of writing to make a convincing turn for Luke. Luke's aesthetic constantly devolving into a red aura with yellow eyes is a solid visual representation of his fall, and giving him red lightning is a rad artistic decision, since I'm unaware of anyone else using red lightning, so why not give the main man himself his own lightning color? It's a well-written turn that employs visuals and what we already know about the psychology of the character of Luke in order to make a convincing turn to the dark side, leading to one of my favorite and least favorite gaming endings. And I say least favorite because we never get a conclusion to this narrative, since after this the developers went into The Force Unleashed 2 and never returned to finish the story of Lord Starkiller. Although they did use Episode 6 as the focal point of the Force Unleashed 2 DLC, but that's a story for another day. This is really a shame, because the turn of Luke Skywalker got me heavily invested in this narrative in a way I wasn't following the previous mission. It was a far more unique plot deviation than the previous mission, and to end the adventure of Lord Starkiller at such a pivotal plot development is very sad for someone who loved this story and this character as much as I do. Thus, our adventure with Lord Starkiller and with The Force Unleashed as a whole comes to an end. For my final thoughts on these Starkiller DLC missions, I'm going to give a comparison of the two in terms of what each did better than the other, and give my final overall thoughts on the pair as a combined adventure. The Tatooine mission was particularly good in its immersion and environment. The cliffs of Tatooine and Jabba's palace were well designed and incredibly true to the movies, and it just felt so nostalgic to be walking what was essentially the same path as Luke from Return of the Jedi. In fact, the nostalgia in general was powerful and well used throughout the level, between Jabba, the Rancor, Boba Fett, and Obi-Wan. Comparatively, Hoth's environment is, well, it's Hoth. The base is true to form, but it's hardly as memorable as Jabba's palace, so the level is not as easy on the eyes as Tatooine. Likewise, there's not much going for it in the nostalgic category, likely because Hoth is one of the most mimicked sequences throughout gaming and Star Wars, so there wasn't this sense of returning to somewhere I haven't been in a long time, which is the foundation of nostalgia. Similarly, Luke is the only cameo, so it doesn't utilize as many assets from the original trilogy as Tatooine. Where the Hoth mission really excels is its narrative. The level does a good job of building up Lord Starkiller as a ruthless, cold, and manipulative figure with his own agenda, and its use of a sequenced conflict with Luke to demonstrate his fall to the dark side is just so good. It went from, with the Tatooine level, a story with cool what-if moments, into an original narrative that I was genuinely invested in, and to this day I am frustrated by its lack of conclusion. And that idea of an original narrative worthy of investment brings me to my conclusive thoughts on this pair of DLC missions. These levels are conceptually so brilliant and have some incredibly impactful moments, and are especially carried by the design and brutal characterization of Lord Starkiller. Despite that, these missions are rushed, and the narrative space between them is significant, and therefore they do indeed feel like DLC missions instead of expansions of the main story. You can tell there's a scramble to get certain environments and concepts into as tightly packed of a bundle as possible. As crazy as it is, I think this story should have been the sequel to The Force Unleashed. The character of Lord Starkiller was honestly so good that the producers should have taken this concept and pitched it as the sequel and given it a full 3-act game that spanned the length of the original trilogy. You cannot tell me that would not have sold with fans, and it would have given the narrative the necessary space required to flesh out levels like this, tell an original story, and then ultimately conclude it. Because despite how much I love these levels in concept and in how they use their nostalgic assets, there's no doubt it leaves me wanting more, both from the individual levels as well as this alternate Star Wars narrative as a whole. There was so much potential with this character and this arc that got condensed and left by the wayside. We got 2 bites of what could have been an incredible, full 3-course meal. If I were in charge of the Star Wars gaming branch today, you better believe the next 2 things I'd have on the docket are a complete remake of The Force Unleashed, followed by an original sequel that takes this concept and rolls it into a brand new retelling of the original Star Wars trilogy. Alas, I'm living in a fantasy with these remarks. What we got were these missions, and these missions were, without a doubt, a ton of fun. I love the character of Lord Starkiller, I love the nostalgia, I love the original story, and I appreciate that they went with this unique route with the game's DLC instead of something safer that was less interesting. Let me know in the comments what you guys think of these missions, as well as the Temple DLC. Were they good? Did you want more? Or do you view them more negatively than I do? Also, if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like, and subscribe to this channel for more videos like this. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and receive exclusive perks, which goes a long way in helping me find the time to craft videos like these for you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm looking forward to the next video with all of you.